what he did was an affront. There was only one episode of violence in the entire Cherokee removal of around 16,000 people, and it was Charlie. And this was really an affront to everything that was trying to be done. You had John Ross with the Cherokee Nation trying to have a peaceful removal under his own accord, under the Cherokees' own initiative to remove themselves, no forced removal. And when this thing happened with Charlie, it led back to the stereotypes of the savage Indians running wild in the mountains. And at that particular moment in time, that was the last thing the Cherokee Nation could afford to do, was have that stereotype played out. But Uchula decided he would assist him, and he had about 100 followers up in the mountains. The Wachacha story that Jim told, he cut it a little short. Wachacha made it back into the mountains, and Wachacha joined Uchula's soldiers. And it was actually Wachacha that captured Charlie. That's in the documents. That's in Lieutenant Foster, who was the colonel, the commanding officer that General Scott sent to these mountains. And as far as Uchula goes, Uchula was, before the Charlie incident, was a bigger threat to the U.S. soldiers than was Charlie, or any thought of that, because Uchula was leading a band of Indians in the mountains that could not be caught. So when General Scott sent Lieutenant Foster down here, he sent him down under 3 initiatives. One is to capture and punish the murderers, as General Scott always referred to Charlie and his sons. Number 2 was to reassure the white settlers that had just recently moved in here that they were completely safe, that the Army was down here taking care of them. And thirdly, and most importantly, was to make sure that Charlie's band did not meet up with Uchela's band and join them. Because when the soldiers came to this area, they had just finished attempting to remove the Seminoles in Florida. And there's a reason the Seminoles in Florida still call themselves the unconquered Seminoles. It's because the U.S. soldiers couldn't move them out. They got down there in the swamps and hid. They couldn't move them out. When the soldiers came up here, they were scared that if the Cherokees in North Carolina wanted to remain, they couldn't prevent that. And they looked in, especially in the Nantahala Mountains and these areas, lots of laurel, steep mountains, caves, and you're talking about a group of people that had lived for millennia in this area. They knew these places. These soldiers didn't. And they were afraid that if Uchela had joined with Zolly and they became hostile, there was nothing they could do about it, and there was no way they could be stopped. So they went out of their way to make sure that didn't happen. Will Thomas did go to Uchela and discuss this with him. And in some of the written records that Thomas wrote to General Scott in the late 1840s, he went up there, according to his letters, scared to death, because he didn't know how Uchela was going to act to him when he went to meet with him. But he explained to him that they need help capturing Charlie for these murders. And there might be a possibility of remaining in North Carolina, but couldn't promise him. Uchela, who had lost his immediate family, he lost his children, he lost his wife hiding in the mountains out of starvation and sickness, any type of hope was better than no hope. So on this slim chance, they joined Lieutenant Foster's group of soldiers. It was physically the Cherokees that captured him. Uchela agreed with Will Thomas to do this under the condition that if we capture him, then Charlie's tried as a Cherokee and punished as a Cherokee. It was not the U.S. government's initiative to have the Cherokees shoot him. That was the conditions the Cherokees set forth to the government. And unlike the legends, George, Jake, and Lowen, the 3 sons, were shot 2 days before Charlie. They were shot the day before Charlie was captured. And he was tried and executed. And it was on Uchula's signal. He dropped his hand when it was time to fire. It was around 12 noon that day. And by this time, the Lieutenant Foster had already pulled the U.S. Army out of this area. And the reason being was Charlie was an old man. Charlie was around 64 years old. His sons, however, were mid to late 20s up into their 30s. They were really the guys that did the killing. And they felt assured that if they were going to shoot the sons, that they would shoot Charlie. As a failsafe, they did appoint 4 of the white settlers in the area to witness it and to give depositions at the Macon County Courthouse. The museum has a copy of one of the collection of a man named Jonas Jenkins. Jonas is the only non-Indian to ever own land on what is now the Qualla boundary, and Jenkins Creek is named after him. And the root of the legend came in what Jenkins said were Charlie's last words to Uchella, and it was basically to bring in my family out of the mountains, give them good advice, make sure that they're safe. And the main thrust of where the Charlie legend began was with Will Thomas. And when James Mooney was coming in the 1880s to talk to Will Thomas, that was the romantic story of Charlie's sacrifice, is what he told James Mooney. That's what Mooney recorded. And you know, even up to some today, there's some scholars that won't challenge Mooney on anything. They think that his word is the gospel. And we find out more and more every day that he told a lot of fact, and there's a lot of good stuff in Mooney's book, but it's not all accurate. And what Mooney left out was the fact that when he interviewed Will Thomas in 1880, he interviewed him in the insane asylum in Morganton. By this time, Will Thomas had already lost his mind. He was losing it before the Civil War, and then after his finances went to pieces, he really went out of his head. And when Mooney interviewed him about the history, he was talking to a man in an asylum. But that story, of course, being romantic and everything that good drama is what became the Zolly legend.
Yeah, back during the time that Jenik Owl was living down in Hanging Dog, was 1838, when all of a sudden one morning they looked out and soldiers were standing in the yard and demanded that they get out of the cabin. And they had to leave everything they owned in that cabin, and they wanted to go back and to feed the cows or get food for the baby and clothing, but they wouldn't allow them to do that. And so they left with the very few things that they had on their back, and they put them in Fort Butler. And the baby was just a tiny child at the time, and so they stayed, according to my aunts and uncles, in Fort Butler for about 6 weeks, and it said that the conditions there were just deplorable, that the mud was 6 inches deep in that fort, and the rain was coming down, and the children began to get sick with whooping cough and measles and dysentery, and the old people began to die. And they wanted the soldiers to let the Cherokee women go out and get medicine out of the woods, and they were reluctant to let them do that. And people continued to die, but eventually they had no choice, and so the soldiers let a few of the Cherokee women leave the fort. They went out into the woods and gathered medicines, and it wasn't long until the whooping cough epidemic was squelched and people began to stop dying. And it said that early one morning, and it's probably in late October, early November, that the gates of the fort were opened, and they started that long, treacherous march to Oklahoma Territory. When they made it to Fort Cass in Tennessee, it said that Old Man Owl was robbed of $70 worth of silver because he was some sort of a spiritual leader. And recent research has stated that he was a part of a conspiracy that was linked with the Welch family down in that region, where they were living to try to keep the Cherokee people in their homeland. And they were conspiring to do everything they could to let them stay here. But evidently it didn't work. And so they continued their journey on toward the Nashville, Tennessee, and passing through Nashville, it said that people would come out on the streets to watch this long line of suffering pass through the town, and just could not believe that the United States could do something so terrible. They made it all the way up toward Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and conditions were getting worse. When they got to Hopkinsville, it said that the winter was so bad that the rivers were frozen over, and they had to wait near Hopkinsville to prepare to cross the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. And the ice flows in those rivers were so bad that they took them 2 weeks before the rivers thawed up any at all. And so then after those 2 weeks, there were about 2,000 people who died on the east side of the rivers. And they eventually got to the point where they were ready to cross, and they asked my great-great-grandfather to count the Cherokees as they were crossing the river, and he told his wife the night before to run away in the darkness, and she did. And he told the soldiers when he started counting the next day that she had been accounted for. And so they told him to go down by the water and check and make sure nobody was hiding behind the bushes. When he did, he jumped into the water, and they came and shot at him many times. They thought he was dead because he didn't come up, and he was breathing through a hollow reed all the time that they were shooting at him. And so he came back out of the water, and the soldier had gone, and he made his way back toward Hanging Dog in Murphy, North Carolina. But you know, the standards were different in those days. A woman could almost walk through the streets carrying a baby, and they let her go. But when a man, a Native American man, tried to make his way through a city, they'd sick the dogs on him, or they would chase him with a group of men or something. And so the mother made it back with a child in a short time. As she got back, she waited for her husband to return, and a year passed, and he had not returned yet. And she was almost ready to give up when she looked out, and all of a sudden she saw her husband coming off the hillside. They were reunited, and they moved into a little place called Birdtown. David Owl did, because he was an interpreter for the council. And so as he, I think that started out like in Graham County to begin with, the council did for the Cherokees, and as the council moved to Cherokee, North Carolina, he moved with it and lived in a little section called Birdtown. And so my family's remained in Birdtown from that day forward, from David, who's buried up on the Fisher Branch, to Solomon and his family buried on the Birdtown Cemetery, and my father Lloyd, who's buried up on Wagon Wheel Gap Road up on the Owl Valley. But that is pretty well the story of the escape of the Trail of Tears in 1838.
Because the reason they was released, when they had them in stockade, a lot of them got away at midnight, a lot of them. So the soldiers said, we can't get them back all together, so we just let them go. That's what they let them go, which way they want then. Some of them had their feet facing west, they said, so one of them went on. Just some of them came back. That is quite a few. We're still here. So that's the way it happened. So that's just like I say. Because some were smart, in other words. They know how to do it, how to get out of the way, get away, I guess. And then everybody just got away. And some of them used to live in that kind of places. They made homes over there.
I guess the most thing I remember about her being a herbalist, medicine woman. You know, I've seen people come in all during the nights with just all kinds of pains. And you see like the doctors today and stuff, I know they do good, but back then, you know, I think she knew, I guess, the Creator, you know, more than anything, close up. Because she'd always, you know, like I said, when she'd done her medicine to the people, she'd always be whispering something, or like a prayer or something. I always figured, you know, everything was I think she's dependent on the Creator a real lot. And that's what disappoints me this day with these kids, or myself even, that we never learned the medicine that she had, the herbs, all that, you know, the roots. I think only a few know them anymore. I don't know how strong they are anymore at that point, but that's the biggest thing I remember about her, because, like I said, And she always told me, you know, I guess love everybody like, you know, you want to be loved, just like, I mean, she knew the Bible real well. She's real straight up.
You know, Maggie was, I guess you could say, nurse midwife. She delivered one of my sisters and one of my brothers. And I remember her coming over in the middle of the night. Of course, you know, Mom would send us to bed early, and she'd say, now you have to go to bed early so that tomorrow you'll have a brother or sister. And so we were all excited, so we'd go to bed early. And it seemed like somehow or another, I guess maybe curiosity got me, and I would get up in the middle of the night, and the baby would already be here. And so one day I went with Maggie. She said, you want to go up in the woods and help me do some work? And I said, sure. So it was early in the morning, so me and Maggie left, and she grabbed a hoe. And so we went in the woods, and she was carrying something in a cloth. And so she dug a hole, and she put this bag in that she had wrapped up, this cloth wrapped up, and she buried it. And when she laid it down in the ground, I looked at it and I was like, man, were there two babies? Did she bury a baby? You know, I wondered till, well, later on as I got older and went to nursing school, I figured out what she buried, and it was not a baby.
She'd walked to 60 miles, her and Grandpa, when Grandpa was on council, and she was the Indian clerk. And they said they'd always stop somewhere about halfway. Just, you know, I guess people really back then, like I said, showed hospitality. And they'd let them stay in their house and eat supper and then move on that next day, you know. And so she said, I guess Winona was born at that time, my aunt. And she said she'd had her on her back, you know, carrying her. And that, to me, you know, I reckon you don't see that anymore. You don't see Indian people doing that anymore. I don't know if Vanessa does that with her baby. Did great. Yeah, but anyway, that's something else, you know, to me, to travel that far. You know, if I had to wake up one morning and do what I'm doing now and start walking, I'd never make it to Robbinsville, you know.
I think she really inspired me because the long walk that she took to go serve on the tribal council. And I just think that's so neat. And yeah, she just, I think every month she got maybe a day or two head start and started walking to be up there in time. And I don't think she ever missed very many council meetings. And that just really inspires me because since I'm in the health field, I just think walking is one of the best things you could ever do for yourself. And I try to teach these kids, you know, like, look, Maggie walked all the way to Cherokee. Why can't we walk to town or walk to the grocery store or wherever we're going? You know, this is for our health. And I know she did it because of her dedication to the tribal council and to her people being a secretary.
And she kept up with the paperwork up there at Cherokee for the tribal council for a lot of years. She'd walk up there. She'd walk all that way. And the roads weren't too good either. But she'd walk up there and she'd stay until council was over. Then she'd walk back home, her and Jarrett both. Jarrett would go with her until his leg got so bad that he couldn't walk anymore.
Okay, if I were picking someone to be the beloved woman, I think it would be someone that would go beyond the call of duty. And you would not be expecting any pay for the things you do. Or any rewards of any kind. I think it would be something that you would do from the heart. Like walking 50, 60 miles